Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Pat Flynn Show. We are here joined by Dr. Matthew Ramage, theologian. We will do a theology-based episode off of his wonderful book called Dark Passages. We're going to examine the Bible in some of its more gory details. Let's be frank, there are some scenes in there, right, that we want to be able to look at and analyze and see, hey, what's going on here? Both because, I think there's two reasons here. One is just to increase our own understanding of God's revelation. But especially in our contemporary culture, there's many objections that are brought up either against the Bible or Christianity as a whole, saying like, hey, how can you guys take this stuff seriously? There's some real gory, ghoulish, almost nightmarish stuff that seems to go on, oftentimes specifically in the Old Testament. So that will be the theme of this conversation. We're gonna grapple with some of that. We obviously can't take every single thing, but hopefully we'll be able to give a perspective and an approach for how to consider and grapple with these issues. So, Dr. Ramage, thank you for coming on the Pat Flynn Show. Great to see you again.
You too, Pat.
Yeah, for some of my listeners, this might be the first time that they're getting acquainted with your work. So, would you mind just briefly introducing yourself, giving us a little bit of your background?
Yeah, sure. Well, my full-time job is Benedictine College. I teach theology there. I've been here for going on 12 years or so, right? Love it. A great Catholic school. And then I also adjunct some classes for Holy Apostles Seminary with its online grad program in theology, which is a lot of fun and rewarding to do also. And so I've been writing, publishing books for 10 years or so, have a number of books. I like to do a lot of popular articles when it comes my way as well, or podcasts I really enjoy doing also. But yeah, I focus a lot on the work of Pope Benedict XVI, also named Joseph Ratzinger before he was Pope, because he was the Bible scholar Pope, and he's still alive, in fact, and is amazing. So I focus on his work, just trying to make that known to the public, disseminating his thought. I deal especially with Bible. So I'm a theologian, but I did a specialization in Bible. So I kind of where doctrine and Bible come together. And I think I got this from my late father, but I always have been interested in just the challenges, apologetics, like the why questions that maybe a lot of people don't feel the need to ask. But whether it's my background, I went to the University of Illinois, a secular school, or whether it's just my temperament, I've always been in these problems. I studied the sciences, I've been satisfied with just simplistic answers. Important as the catechism is, I always wanted to go deeper and answer objections. That's where I come from in a lot of this. And yeah, academically, this book, Dark Passages of the Bible, was my first book. So, I've added refined a few things over the last 10 years, but I still do a lot of work in that area. And the gospel I have a book on, and what faith means in an age of uncertainty. I have my last book called The Experiment of Faith on. And right now, in fact, I just finished one on the Bible and evolution. So that's a little summary of what I'm up to.
Fantastic. Maybe we could start by just maybe diffusing a little bit of tension, because this specific area is not an area that I focused a lot on personally. I mean, if you press me with some of the dark passages, I could probably give a halfway decent response to show that it's not as threatening or as crazy as people make it seem. But I guess the way I've kind of approached it as somebody who came into the church, right, was a religious skeptic for a while, is that if I already have independent reasons to think that God exists and God is perfectly good, and I already have independent reasons to think that Christ walked out of his tomb and left us with an authoritative church that gave us scripture, great. I'm good, right? Right. You see, like there's just an end run there. So like, even if there's parts in scripture that don't seem to make sense to me, or there's like a superficial tension, not for me, I have an independent basis where I think I can see, okay, maybe I don't see the reason for this, but not seeing a reason doesn't mean that I see there is no reason for it, or that there isn't a way to interpret this that is consistent with my prior commitment. So I guess what I'm saying is, maybe there's a way we can open this up that could diffuse some tension or alleviate concerns from like maybe a global perspective.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That's a really interesting way to begin. Okay. This is the preface that has to be made in light of that. This will convince no atheist to become a Christian, right? This is not intended for that audience. And I remember one of the first Amazon reviews I was looking at when it came out is like, this is not going to convince anybody. Well, it's not its point. Book says. And that's what Aquinas would say, by the way. The subtitle of that book is Engaging Scripture with St. Thomas Aquinas and Benedict XVI. So Aquinas would say, if someone can't accept your first principles, all you can do is give intelligent answers. Like, here's what it would look like if you believed. And the faith can't be against reason, right? It can be beyond reason, but you can't give answers that are just cop-outs or contradictory. So I think that is an important preface to this whole thing. And another preface globally, Aquinas says, all truth, no matter what its source, is of the Holy Spirit. So we shouldn't be afraid of objections. We shouldn't be afraid of learning from someone who critiques the faith. We should be able to address them and answer them as well. But yeah, ultimately, this comes from perspective of people already believing. And we could go back to Augustine on this, Anselm, St. Anselm, Middle Ages. I believe in order that I might understand. And in fact, he defines the enterprise of theology as faith-seeking understanding. Mm-hmm. So it sounds paradoxical, but you don't understand, finally you get it, now you believe. It's a matter of trust and living the faith. And paradoxically, one of the things that Pope Benedict says that I put in my last book, Experiment of Faith, is you only really see the truth of Christianity by living the quote unquote experiment, putting all your chips on the table. So once you're living it, then you actually start reading the Bible and you're like, oh my gosh, this thing's not the good book. This is the evil book. There's all kinds of problems in this. How do I believe? So you live your faith, but then you got to start investigating these questions. Those are a couple of prefatory comments I think that are needed anyway.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I'm glad we started on that note. So if you're already a skeptic, if you're already an atheist, I don't know, go listen to some of my other episodes. This one ain't going to be.
Yeah, go meet some really good Christians, not some lame ones. Start, being with them, learning the way of life, because it's a discipleship process. And, it's a life of the sacraments and a life of mercy and a life of all this stuff, not just intellectual.
Yeah, I'm into that. But we are going to try and take a mature look at some of these dark passages. So, okay, where do we begin this conversation, Dr. Ramage? Do we want to start maybe with how Catholics should look at the Bible, different interpretive contexts? Yeah, you lead the way here, please.
We could go for 45 minutes on this, but I guess to put it in a nutshell, I'm going to just go with the catechism, all right? You've got to look at any passage in the Bible, but especially troubled ones. You got to look at the whole Bible, not just an isolated verse. You have to look in light of the whole tradition, how this was read by the early church fathers, but also in the modern period and the tools we have in the modern period. And there's also a principle that truth can't contradict truth. So just for the sciences, for instance, if we can have really good certitude about the age of the universe being more than 6,000 years old, which we do, it's more like 13.7 billion, or about the evolution of Homo sapiens 200,000 years ago, which we have, then evolution can't be contradicted by Genesis. It can't be teaching that. And it turns out that's not just foisting or reading upon it. Once you study it in its original Hebrew context, it wasn't doing science. So that's a different topic than dark passages, but it shows how it illustrates it. Now, in the dark passages, just a tentative example, we can go in detail, is, if you see a violence passage, you've got to look at that not on its own, just as a one-liner. You got to look at that as a part of a progression that leads up to Christ, which the church fathers in catechism call the divine pedagogy, divine teaching method. So you can't isolate an individual verse, this is Pope Benedict's quote now, and say, oh, that's infallible. The Bible is not always trying to tell you exactly what to believe. Sometimes it's showing you what you shouldn't do, actually. And so it's not a bunch of divine dictations and propositions. And yeah, that makes life a little bit more complicated for the Christian. Okay, then other thing by way of preface, I would say, Pat, is I like to just use a shorthand formula that Ratzinger gave. We need to look at the ancients and the moderns, not just one or the other. So the ancients, a lot of good Catholics say, well, let's just look at Thomas Aquinas and Augustine. Well, they're wonderful, right? I love these guys, but they didn't know everything. And they had a lot of tools that they lacked a lot of tools, I should say, that we have today. They didn't know Hebrew, Jerome being a notable exception. They didn't have the modern scientific discoveries. They didn't have the archaeological discoveries. In a sense, they just didn't ask the questions we ask today. They just kind of assumed, that the author knew the mind of God perfectly in these things. So what Benedict/Ratzinger does for a shorthand is he says, let's call the ancient method, the medievals and patristics method A. They share a common approach, which is beautiful. The Bible's true, it's inspired, but it has its shortcomings. And let's call the modern historical critical, all the literary tools approach, method B. What we need, he says, is a method C. It's not like a method as in the scientific method of follow these steps. It's rather an approach which takes the strengths of the ancients and the moderns and tries to purify them of any weaknesses they might have. And if we do that, we're on the right track. And lastly, by intro, if you want to understand what is without error, the Bible, it's inerrancy, as the church says, you have to seek out what the author is intending to teach to his original audience. The Second Vatican Council, in its document called Dei Verbum, on the Word of God, says that. You got to know its literary genre, its audience, and seek to find what is this text trying to teach to its original audience. Because we often assume, as an evangelical, like Peter Entz says, it's we're reading someone else's mail. And
Right.
Forget, this is not our mail. Like, it applies to us, as we can talk about, but it had an original audience. Then we got to grasp that.
Right. Now, how, so all that's fantastic. Thank you, by the way. That's very helpful. Genre as well, right? I forget where I first heard it. I know Bishop Barron has repeated it. You know, if somebody asks a question, well, do you take the Bible literally? You can say, well, do you take the library literally? I guess it depends what section we're in, right? What type of genre are we engaging with? So any other remarks about that? I think you kind of covered that, but maybe
no, that's worth a separate comment. The literal is this equivocal term. And when people use the word literal today, I want to comment on the word myth in a minute too. They mean video camera. The ancients didn't think of it that way. They didn't even have video cameras. I used to say tape recorder. Now I've had to shift video camera. Analogy we want to use is literal means the literary sense. In fact, I remember a professor way back when saying, let's translate it the literary sense, because a literary sense might be metaphorical. Like, no one reads an eye for an eye, tooth for, or let me put it this way. No one reads Jesus in the Beatitudes. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, and then go pluck out your eye. The one I started to mention, the Old Testament, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, they kind of did mean that literally in a sense, which was, it was meant to stop the amount of violence. You can't do more violence than they did to you, but you could retaliate in the Old Testament. Or as my wife brought up recently, if you hear the parable of the Good Samaritan and the inn to which the beaten man was brought, if you did an archaeological search for the inn, I guess that's valid, but you're probably barking up the wrong tree there. It wasn't meant to be like a historical story, even maybe it had a basis in history. It's a parable, right? So you've got to grasp the genre. And myth is the same way. People think myth means false or a lie. But if you read the great literary masters, the people most of us Catholics today really like, not a Catholic, C.S. Lewis, very good, G.K. Chesterton, Tolkien, John Paul and Pope Benedict, the popes speak this way too. Like, Genesis and parts of the Bible contain myth, because I'm going to use C.S. Lewis's definition. Myth is not equal to falsehood. Myth is a real, though unfocused, gleam of divine truth that's falling upon the human imagination. So it's not perfect. It's not metaphysics. It's not abstract. It's not clear, but it really does convey truth. And there are portions of the Bible that are written in that genre. I mean, not the Gospels, but there are portions, like if we read about God and the mountain wrapped in smoke and God changing his mind and the flood and these type of things.
Yeah, very good. So hopefully people can see the value in this stage setting before we get into the specific details, which we're about to. One other thing you know what? I'll hold off on that for now, because it just kind of flew out of my mind. We were chatting beforehand how neither of us got very much sleep last night. So I appreciate you doing most of the talking in this conversation.
Sure.
I actually fell asleep on the floor of my kid's bedroom last night and slept with like a 3-foot blanket. You know, one of just those nights your kid's up, you go in there and you wake up, it's 5 a.m. You're still in your kid's room, right?
Oh man, this is the one thing that wakes me up, is talking theology. But yeah, I slept like 4 hours the night before for no apparent reason. Then this time, the 2-year-old comes in, wakes us up. And then after an hour of laying in bed, I get out of bed and I'm sitting there on my chair and, then she comes back in there again. And so here we are. But yeah, I'm awake now, so it's.
We'll see what these two tired old dads can do. So what do you think is a good example to start with to show people how we can begin to grapple with some of these? And you're right, they're not all of them are dark passages. We have other difficult passages that you've hinted at, like God changing his mind, which seems to clash against the divine simplicity and stuff like that. Give us one. Where should we begin? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, you mentioned the other ones. Like in my book, this book that we're using as the basis, I called it Dark Passages, but it really deals with several different themes. It's mainly about laying out the principles, as I felt no one had really done properly. But then we apply it to the violence passages where God's commanding apparently evil things, and the authors like Ecclesiastes denying the afterlife, and the God changing his mind, and the appearance of multiple gods. But the easy one to begin with that everybody always brings up is the genocide, apparently, right? The claim that the Israelites slaughtered everybody when they came into the promised land in the book of Joshua, and that, therefore God is evil. I mean, this is the one that the atheists bring up. So I suppose we should start with that and just make sure we cover it.
Yeah. So for people who might not be familiar with the passage, which one are we talking about?
Well, you've got Joshua chapter 6 is pretty famous. I could pull this up in my Bible here because I've got my software loading right now. Perfect. Deuteronomy 7, Joshua 6. Here, let me do that real quick and see if I can give you an exact quote. Mm-hmm. So Deuteronomy 7, when they enter the land, they're commanded, you must utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. Okay, that's one verse. Joshua 6, and the Lord God gave him over to us, and we defeated him and his sons and his people, and we captured all his cities and utterly destroyed every city, men, women, and children. We left none remaining. Those are a couple of pretty famous ones. Now, in the Joshua passage, it's not God commanding it, it's just what they did, apparently at God's command. Deuteronomy passage, God is saying to do it. So people have various ways of trying to kind of get around that. But when you read those in conjunction with the many other examples, it's pretty clear that these guys thought God wanted to have them wipe out everybody, or at least they said God wanted to do that, right? There was some pretty serious killing, and not just of combatants going on here.
Right. Yeah, very good. And like I said, we're going to take a mature look at this. And you're right. I think sometimes people try to weasel out of these things. I'm not a big fan of that. So how do we grapple with this in a mature sense? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to just refer to C.S. Lewis real quick, because I want to talk about a couple of Psalms at some point if we have time.
Definitely.
But Lewis says, look, we should just admit there's hate there festering, but also we shouldn't just write it off as evil and wrong and worthless. So there's that extreme on either side you want to avoid. Okay, so I actually, when I teach this, I have a few different options I like to lay out for people. I think that's a healthy thing to do, because the church, doesn't require any single interpretation on this. It's really about helping us understand our faith better and defending against objections. But I like to lay out options in the spirit of G.K. Chesterton, who says the church is like this large playground with really high walls. The walls are the dogmas. You got to believe that. But then there's a lot of flexibility in there. And even if I'm really convinced your interpretation's wrong, it might still be okay in a sense.
Right. It's similar to the issues with predestination, right? The church says, okay, you at least have to believe this, you at least have to believe that, but in between these boundaries, have at it, right?
Exactly.
You have all these different models and proposals, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we just want to avoid, as Augustine and Aquinas quoting him says, making the faith look ridiculous to unbelievers, basically.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So I guess what I would say is on those, one option is that of Aquinas. And all of my Thomist friends would say this is the right one. That's fine. I disagree. But it's a very classical interpretation. And it says, look, we all have original sin. We all deserve death. So Aquinas, I think this is Prima Secunda 9452. If anybody reads Thomas out there, that's, I think, where this is, where he says that God can command you to kill anybody because they deserve it anyway. And that may well be true. But the way that Aquinas, I always thought, was looking at this was he thinks that God's giving a direct command to these people. But I was talking to a really good Thomist friend. I'm a Thomist of the less strict observance, perhaps, than some of my friends. But I was talking to this friend the other day who said...
We call you a softer Thomist.
Yeah, I'm a soft Thomist. I'm a Ratzingerian Thomist. But so You could read Aquinas there saying, look, God's the primary cause of everything that happens. And he uses secondary, or what Aquinas calls instrumental causes, humans, to carry out his plan. But sometimes he just, it's his will, like the old Greek myth about the thread being cut. Like when it's your time to die, it's God's will, no matter who did it to you. And so you could read Aquinas as saying that, but at least a lot of interpreters, and maybe this is Aquinas himself, think that God issued a direct command. Hey, go kill those kids over there.
Like a sort of like deputizing, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if you read Aquinas really loosely in a way, I'm not sure he really intended, you could make that okay in my book. But I tend to agree with Pope Benedict when he spoke at his Regensburg address, pretty famous talk he gave in 2006, where he says that violence is incompatible with the nature of God. Like, yeah, God allows all this type of stuff, but for God to command you to go and kill children, well, that's what terrorists do, and the atheist, I think, is right to bring that up. So anyway, that you could, if you want to take a strict, traditional line, you could say, look, everybody deserves death. But then I think what you had to be ready to do at that point is you have a dream tonight and God says, hey, go kill your neighbor's kids. Would anybody do that? I hope not.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I really hope not. I don't want to live in a world where people think they're hearing God command them to kill people. I think you do live in a world like that if you talk about terrorists. So anyway, that's my approach to the classical. But that's one option. It's not mine, but I want to throw that out there for people.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. A few considerations, and I don't know if this will take us too far afield. I was recently chatting with Father Gregory, actually on predestination, and we got on the topic, which is a big one with Thomas, of whether God is a moral agent.
Mm-hmm.
And Brian Davies comes down pretty hard as saying, no, it's that's way too anthropomorphic. God doesn't issue commands to himself. He's not a moral agent. So to, take what, might be the moral constraints of a human and just kind of throw them off onto God is just a huge category mistake, Davies says. And I'm super sympathetic to that. I don't think God is a moral agent if that's what we're doing. However, and this is what I said to Father Gregory, is that I don't think that means that we can't have moral expectations of God. Mm-hmm. I think we certainly can have moral expectations of God. So I'm just going to throw that out there. If you want to do anything with that or comment, if it's relevant to this, otherwise we can just bracket it off.
No, I like Davies a lot, by the way. But yeah, I think it is anthropomorphic. And then the other thing I think about that is, and I don't know, again, I wish I would have listened to that. It sounds like a fun conversation I could go back to now. But moral expectation of God seems to make sense to me. Honestly, I don't know if this is fair or not, but it's almost to me as if Aquinas is forgetting to read this in light of Christ. Like in light of God as love, which the Jews did not know, can you really expect God to go and command evil? I just loaded the question, okay? Can you really expect God to go and command murder? I don't think so. And I don't think Pope Benedict thinks so either. But, there are a lot of really good, smart Catholics who disagree, including Thomas Aquinas.
Right. And here's my, so I guess I'm a card-carrying, dues-paying Thomist of various, but, my position on Thomas is he's a great guide. He always deserves the benefit of the doubt, but he was just wrong on some things, straight up. Like we know he was wrong on some things and some pretty big things too that the church teaches. So when it comes down to it, if it's truth or Aquinas, we have an obligation to truth, or if it's the church or Aquinas, we have an obligation to the church. I just think those are considerations to keep in mind. I'm not taking any jabs at my harder Thomist friends, but it's something that we just want to be able to acknowledge that, hey, sometimes Aquinas could just be off a bit, right?
Yeah. And what's really cool though is I've met so many good people, a lot of Dominicans especially, who are just so open, flexible, and in the best sense of the word. And they'll take Aquinas as their authority and their guide, but they'll bring in anything else they need to. And it's really neat to be in dialogue with a lot of guys. So that would be Aquinas's position. Okay, here's the second position. I should probably move on, right? This is the one I tended toward, and now I'm torn between 2 and 3 that I'll give you. But the one that I used in the book is basically like Ratzinger type of style, which is, let's assume the basic history of the narrative. And then, all right, now what you need to do is realize like modern people do, that these guys are literary authors. They're truly human authors, and they have limitations. A lot of Catholics still continue to think the Bible is just dropped down from heaven type of thing, like the way Muslims think of the Quran. But they're true human authors, and they aren't always right in what they hold in their heads. The question you have to ask is, what is their real purpose? What's the real teaching? Or even better, as Pope Benedict says, what is the church trying to say through their words? And if I may, just aside to explain this, C.S. Lewis gives a cool image in his book Miracles. It's called Horrid Red Things, a chapter where he says, okay, let's tell a little girl, don't take this medicine, all right? I forgot to take my kidney meds last night for my transplant. That's not a good thing to do if you're on a transplant. But anyway, so I noticed that because of my sleep issues. And let's say my kid accidentally took my pills, which they did not, thanks be to God. Well, I can explain to them, don't take these pills because they're bad for you. And they might accidentally think, oh, they've got little worms in them, little red worms. Well, they would be incorrect in image, but their concept would be right. Like the point got across. Mm-hmm. That's the way then he says that it is even in the New Testament in some respects. Like you'll have an image of heaven as kind of a sky, or in Genesis, the waters above the heavens, the Jews really thought were water, and they really thought Sheol, the underworld, was under the world. And so here's how it applies to the passage at hand. They may have well thought God wanted them to go kill all these kids because it was their land, righteously, they should take it. So you may just have to admit they didn't fully get it, but what was the essential point? Well, that's up for discussion, but it's like, look, go, yeah, you're supposed to be in the land. And then their exact methods they used, that's on them. But it's really important to recognize the Bible is not using quotation marks anyway. These aren't direct quotations of God. So as part of the divine pedagogy now, this is the hermeneutic, the principle of interpretation here, that they gradually got closer towards Christ, but they didn't have a full understanding yet. And so like a Thomistically inspired distinction I like to bring in is you could say that there's a distinction to be made between God's permissive and active will, mm-hmm. or primary, secondary causality. Like God's in charge of everything, yeah, but as part of his will, he allows human freedom, and he allowed them to kill these people. So that would be a second interpretation. That's one that I think is valid. I'm pretty fine with that, although there is a third one and that I want to bring into the picture as well.
Yeah, great. Let's keep moving. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the third one would be actually a very modern interpretation, which is incidentally very ancient, as I'll come to in a moment. So when I first encountered this several years ago, I was like, I don't know about that. But basically, archaeology has been showing, and again, I'm not an archaeologist, I've studied it, but I can't claim a PhD in that field. But from the people I read or talk to who seem to know what they're talking about, it's the excavations that date to the time of Joshua don't seem to line up with the Bible. And so what a lot of them are saying is, look, these were not even historical in the first place, at least the conquest narrative. There's a lot of things. They didn't actually kill all these people. Well, that would be interesting. It would change the game a little bit, because then the purpose was never literal in the sense of prescriptive in the first place. And so from this perspective, what it would be is a couple of things. If you want to look at it from like a political standpoint, it was propaganda they were using to try to justify their empire and go wipe out everybody else. But I think like a Christian approach could be really cool here, which is anything that's not of God, wipe it out. Like it could have been meant in that allegorical sort of way.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And it was hyperbolic, it was hyperbole. So what's fascinating is I kind of held this in the back of my mind. And a few years ago, the Pontifical Biblical Commission, which is not infallible, but it's an office of the Vatican, pretty interesting stuff, that the Pope will kind of stamp as not being heretical. It says that is the way to interpret this. It actually kind of came down pretty strong on that being the interpretation.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And then it added, this actually lines up with the patristic one of, say, Origen of Alexandria, sort of the father of allegorical spiritual exegesis in the church, who said, no, it wasn't meant to be literal in the first place. I thought it was a funny example and really fascinating, if that's true, that the ancient, very ancient, and modern line up at that point. So,
right.
Like to number 2, number 3, it just depends on how much is historical. And we can give criteria, we can make judgments, but at the end of the day, we don't know how much of it's is history, how much is not. Right. So
Right.
I like to open both of those to people.
Yeah. Interesting. You say 2 and 3. I guess I'd kind of lean between 1 and 3 with a stronger direction in 3. But I'm not a theologian, so what do I know? But it just, because just to play on the Christian and spiritual note, the idea here, and I've heard this before, and I'm quite attracted to it, honestly, is that anything that isn't of God, sin, you show no quarter, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is attractive to me. Like we just want to show no mercy to anything. And we don't mean like literally like go out and like, so like we mean in our own lives, right? Any sin that is creeping up in our own lives, we want to just stamp it out immediately, furiously, right? Is that a way to think about this? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I might even bring in another text real quick here, if that's okay. So Psalm 137 is this beautiful Psalm, 137. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and wept. Our captors asked us for songs. Then you can't tell this unless you really read it in the spirit was written, but it's sarcastic at this point. Our captors say, sing for us one of Zion's songs. They're mocking Jews. And then it goes back to the psalmist who says, how can we sing the song of the Lord in the land of exile, ... And you have that famous, beautiful line of God, I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Now, at the very end, though, he bursts out, "O daughter of Babylon, you devastator, blessed is he who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rocks." So he's in exile, presumably. It's not before the exile that was written. So he's been decimated. They've had their temple destroyed, a lot of their family killed. They're off as slaves of the Babylonians, and he's wanting revenge upon them. So it's not per se a command to go kill them, but I'll tell you how the church fathers read this. And this is now Saint Benedict, not Pope Benedict. I teach at Benedictine College, so we're inspired by this great guy. He says you had to read those little ones as your sins. You want to destroy your beginnings of sin, because if you don't, they'll turn into full-fledged vices, and then you have an addiction and you can't hardly get rid of it.
Right.
And I like to now add to that something he doesn't say, but it's consistent with the tradition. Like, bash your occasions of sin too. Like, that's the best way to avoid sin in my book. Not that I always live it out, is just don't even go there.
Right.
And so that would be the spiritual interpretation. And perhaps that is what they meant. I can't help but thinking there really was some festering hatred going on there. But at least as God being the primary author of scripture, if that's not what the original guy meant, it definitely is a proper application of it to our times.
Yeah. And both of those things can be true, right? And I think there's no reason to think that they not only couldn't be, but wouldn't be. Yep. And I think it's also important for people to realize that these interpretations we're giving, I mean, you're obviously citing some very early thinkers here. It's not a contrived way to avoid modern objections, right? That these, and we could say the same thing about St. Augustine, that like somewhat 1500 years before Darwin, he was saying, look, we don't need to take the creation of the world as 6 literal days, right? So it's like, he wasn't like looking forward and saying, oh, hold on, evolution and modern astrophysics is coming, so we better be ready for it. No, he was just saying, like, internally in the text, we have reasons for not, taking the sort of, I guess, what's now known as like the fundamentalist or creationist view and things like that. The point I'm just showing is that, like, this isn't like the church looking at like modern objections, but like, we got to do anything we can to get away from them, right? No, this actually goes back. Doesn't mean that everybody in the tradition thought this way, because I think you would know this better than me, but a lot of early thinkers, there was a mix, right? You had some that took things very literally. You had some that probably took things a little too allegorically, but then you had those that were a mix, like saying, no, I think this should be taken literally. This should be allegorically. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, well, honestly, and this is one of the reasons why, like, number one is not attractive to me. The church fathers a lot of times take things, they don't pay attention to the actual context or have no way of knowing the original context. So they say, well, of course he didn't mean this. Well, if you read a C.S. Lewis, they'll say, yeah, he did. Like, you go read C.S. Lewis' Reflections on the Psalms. And I'm just bringing it up because it's something people can pick up and read really easily. But like, no, the guy really thought, he really did hate these people. And when you talk about Genesis, no, they really did think the world had a dome on it. Like, this is not just allegorical. It's not meant to, its primary purpose is not to be history, but they really did have that worldview, and we can show it in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. But a lot of times, like, the ancients just, it can't be true. So they can't really have thought that, but they did think that.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, but the point there is that even if they thought as human authors that this was the case, it doesn't mean that God isn't intending a certain interpretation for his church.
Exactly. And that's why.
And that's what I'm trying to emphasize, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's important to emphasize that and the one I'm mentioning, because if you don't grasp the one I'm pointing out, the atheist is always going to say, well, you're not really dealing. That's what he said. Any obvious reading of the text would say that. So if you read it as literature, you have to admit that, but then you have to say what you're saying also. You get, God works through that, through the limited, finite human authors. And we really need both of those if we're going to do justice to this and kind of a virtuous mean between the two extremes out there.
Yeah, and maybe now would be an idea to talk about divine pedagogy of, it's, that God is like, he's working us towards a goal, and he's clearly, obviously permitting certain things to go on or occur for a certain amount of time. For various reasons. We've already talked about God's permissive will because he's progressive in salvation history. And I think that that's something that's often overlooked. Maybe just a few comments on that. I think that can be a very helpful thing.
Gosh, there's so many examples out
Mm-hmm.
there. So many examples. I mean, I don't really want to go there, but I'm just going to say it since it popped into my head. Like in Leviticus, the penalty for a lot of sins is capital. Like you get caught doing sodomy, you're dead. And now the church still teaches that marriage and sexuality should be between a man and a woman. So I don't mean to go down a moral route. I'm not really interested in that at the moment, unless you want to. But the point is, you don't do that anymore, right? But at that time, the culture, that's the way you punished it. Hopefully we don't imitate that punishment anymore. But you also don't want to say, oh, it's just all wrong. You read a lot of people, and that's what they do. Mm-hmm. Really bright guys, like a guy who's a secular scholar, an agnostic, Bart Ehrman with the Gospels, just say the morality is completely wrong. The Christian has to make this distinction that, yeah, the Old Testament morality is not perfectly replicable, but it's a path towards Christian. And you have these glimmers of amazing, amazing truth and beauty. But then you have your violence, vindictiveness, slavery, etc., that type of stuff. And so it's not as simple as just go grab one quotation. So the gradual teaching of Israel is so important. And if I may bring up another one, this is one that's dealing with the afterlife. I trace this at very great length in the last chapter of this book, because this part was originally part of my dissertation. I had to trim it down, but like the afterlife, the Jews, most people did not believe in the afterlife. Per se, if you were a Jew early on, you went down to Sheol, the underworld. Everybody went down there. Now, eventually, they began to believe in the resurrection of the body, but it wasn't until about the 2nd century before Christ in the Maccabean period that they believed in it. So a lot of pieces had to get into the puzzle first. And right. What's interesting to me is it was through their desperation, through their martyrdom that you read about in 2 Maccabees, for example, that they finally came to this. It was like in our lives, sometimes you hit rock bottom and then you finally open up, you pray, you see things, you see the light. And that's what it took for the Jews. So, and there's a moral story for us today because there's always an application for us. Yes. The Catechism talks about in prayer, when you're in darkness, dryness, that can be the time you make the most progress.
Amen to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I think about this a lot. Like if we're always just full and we're always on our phones and always doing something, but we just don't ever take time to contemplate and be, then, we're not going to actually see the light. And sometimes God allows suffering for that very purpose.
Yeah. I think that's such an important thing to keep coming back to, because, aside from the dark passages, there's just suffering and evil in the world, and often hear, well, why hasn't God done anything about it? Why isn't God doing anything about it? The answer is he has, and he is, right?
Yeah.
It just isn't on your preferred time frame, right? Yeah. And I think that's it. I think people just, or at least it just begs the question to assume that, because the whole story of Christianity, the reality of it, is God's response to the fallen, suffering, sinful world, right? It's just a very big response that's progressive, and it doesn't maybe happen as quickly as all of us would want it to. But I think that's an important thing just to keep in mind. It's not like God is indifferent or passive to this stuff, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, if I may add a little interpretation that's not authoritative, but this one was originally from my wife. Maybe someone wrote it. I've never seen it, but on the flood, she likes to put it this way. What's the point of the flood story? Well, at least one of the major points is if you flood the whole earth, it's just going to happen again. That is, the sin's going to happen again. So you save only the righteous man. And what's he do? He plants a vineyard. Okay. He gets drunk. Not okay. His son Ham sees his father's nakedness, which is probably a euphemism for incest. That's not okay. So in other words, as the Second Vatican Council would say, the disorder is in the heart of man. And so like we're the problem, and we all need to come to terms with that, and then learn how to accept the crosses we bear. And when we sin, get up and go again, because Christ has died for us, right? And he's risen, and that's what we're called to share in.
Yeah. So I know we're, I'm happy to keep jamming for however long. This has been really great. And hopefully, again, what I really want people to get out of this conversation is, of course, we could go one by one through all the different things, but I want them to see that there are sophisticated, mature ways of dealing with this. And I think even just seeing that in one or two instances, especially the more difficult ones, hopefully that will inspire confidence and also arouse curiosity. Because like you said, like there's something that God obviously wants us to get out of these passages, right? And it's faith-seeking understanding. So yeah, tell me where you want to go here, Dr. Ramage. Do you want to do one more specifically, or do you want to... Yeah, because I want to respect your time as well. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. Well, let's see. I have a Walmart order to pick up here in a few minutes.
Yeah.
It's a real. But yeah, I could take anything else we want to, but I was just thinking through, I mean, we've covered the main principles I would say need covered. I really, honestly, like I wrote in this book, I spent 200 and some pages doing it because I wanted to make a scholarly argument. It's not a pew book, by the way. Give to the person who doesn't know a lot about their faith type of book. But like, if you lay out the principles, if you've got divine pedagogy, understand the gradualness of revelation. If you understand to seek the original point, its original context, if you then realize, hey, the human authors are limited, but God's also author. And the key thing is really, this book is meant to be lived, and you've got to talk to God and figure out how to live it. Then I think you're in the right place with all this. And then individually, I would recommend like Trent Horn, who works for Catholic Answers, has a book where he goes in detail into a lot of these. I blurbed that book. I like it a lot. Do I think he's right on every point? No. Does anybody think I'm right on every point? No. But that's a really good book out there.
But you're on the same playground, right?
Right. Like that's a great book to go to. You can pick up my book. Again, it's going to be deeper, longer, a little more intense, a little bit less application and more on principles, but it does do that part. And, you know, like I've given a couple of Thomistic Institute lectures, which are going to sound pretty similar to this, but a different ordering and everything, and some different questions come up. But yeah, and bottom line is, like, this applies to everything, and it's just a matter of getting into it and find the church fathers, but also find a good modern commentary. Now, there are a lot of good ones out there. Don't just read whatever someone on the internet says. Here I am on the internet, right? But
especially if his name's Pat Flynn.
Yeah, like listen to what Pat Flynn says, right? But other than that, you can't really trust it. But really, the library, like, go get a real legit Bible commentary. And here's the deal. At the end of the day, the authority question is really a difficult one. Like, who do I trust, this scholar or that scholar? Here's why it's going to be Catholic. If it's really important, the church will have defined it. You know, like, go to the catechism, show me where it says how you have to interpret Joshua chapter 6. It's not going to be there. So people get all up in arms about all these things. And I love it, or else I wouldn't be here talking to you right now, right? Obviously, you too like it a lot and are interested. But like, people don't need to lose their faith over it. They need to, they need to think more deeply, pray more deeply, and be able to answer objections. But it really is important, because I teach a lot of permanent deacon candidates. I had one ask me a good question last week. It was like, why should I worry about this stuff? It wasn't meant in a like, this is a waste of time sense. It was like a sincere, I don't get why this is important type of thing. And it had to do with the Gospels in this case, not the dark passages. But like, why should we know about this skeptic stuff? It just makes our faith less easy. Well, if you want to help someone who's struggling with their faith, good luck if you don't understand the actual issues.
Right.
So it's a work of mercy, I think, at the end of the day, too.
Yeah, no, that's really beautiful. I really appreciate your perspective and help on this, Dr. Ramage. So I'm going to encourage everyone to grab the book. It's called Dark Passages. Amazon, the best place to grab a copy?
Yeah, I mean, CUA Press sells it. I know they like to sell it through there because they don't get the Amazon price taken away. I don't make much money no matter what. But
the life of an author, you gotta love it.
But yeah, Amazon's very easy to get it.
Fantastic. Well, we'll link that in the show notes. I will also link to conversations you had recently with our good friend Eric Robinson and Dr. Tyler McNabb. So I know you go into some more specific examples so people can supplement this conversation with that one, as well as the Thomistic Institute talks. Before we say goodbye, Dr. Ramage, any last resources, websites, anything else you want to mention for people to keep up with what you're doing?
I don't blog per se, but I do put all my publications up when they come on my website, Matthew Ramage, like damage with an R, Matthew, RAMAGE.com. So you can find that, all my different links and things like that. So definitely that, I do some Facebook. I just started a Twitter account just so it's easy to share things in 20
Yeah, we're linked up now. I saw that. Excellent.
Yeah, I figured I might as well. It's like a super easy way to share and find out what's going on with other people. So yeah, that's what I would say. Start at my website and you can find out what I've got going on through that.
Beautiful. Dr. Ramage, thank you so much for being here.
Peace, Pat. Thanks.